What is the good life? Good life. What is the good life? If you've studied philosophy or the great thinkers, you know that this is a question that men and women have been struggling with for thousands of years, from Solomon to Aristotle. But I want you to just for a moment shelve your deep philosophical ponderings here, and let's talk concrete terms here. Like when you daydream, when you fantasize about, like, what would life be like if I, just my best possible life? Like, what would a good life look like? What would you daydream about? Like, what do you desire? What do you want? And perhaps that's a little too personal. And so let's move aside from that for just imagine you were to look at your neighbors, at just broadly, Americans, 2018 across the board. Like, when they daydream about what is the good life, what does that include? What picture do you see in your mind? So when we go through this, I don't want to speak for you, but I would say broadly, I would include for me, it's there's something relational there. Like there's got to be, a good spouse, me and my spouse, and we're going to have a couple little kids. And let's see, what else would we include in that? I've got good hair. We got good hair. And this is my dream. I've got abs, muscles. So I've got health. I've got relational health. I've got kids. What are my kids like? They get like straight A's and they're really good at sports. And where do I live? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's not over the top, but it's a fairly good sized house. Yeah. And what do I drive? I probably drive, some type of Batmobile type Maserati thing, And you start thinking, okay, well, how do I vacation? Well, for me, it certainly looks like a boot. Yeah, that's Italy. You start thinking about, like, well, what do I eat, and how do I dress, and what do I do for fun? And of course, we're gonna have, box seats or box tickets to, Dallas Cowboys, and and it's gonna include maybe, I don't know, Broadway shows, I don't know, something like that. And you start working out, and then of course, every good American family has to have a dog, and I know that's a really bad-looking dog, but you get the idea. Huh? He's a Dr. Seuss dog. So what do you picture? I mean, okay, maybe this is a caricature. Maybe this is just like what I picture, or what people out there broadly picture. But what do you picture? Like, really? Not like in church picture, like not like I would give Bibles to orphans. But what do you think about when you think, like, this is what I look forward to in life? Like, this is a caricature, but there's probably something to it, like something to that. And so I say this to say that there's nothing particularly wrong with any of these except my ability to draw. There's nothing bad, nothing evil about any of these things. These are good things that I hope you all get to enjoy. But when we come in here, though, and we open the scriptures, this is where it gets kind of awkward. You see, according to the scriptures, the good life itself, is defined by a man named Jesus. Like, he is the cause of life. He's the author of life. He's the purpose of life. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the good life. And bizarrely, his life looks nothing like the American dream life of 2018. Nothing. Like, you start going through the list, and he never made it out of the lower class. He never got married. He never traveled internationally except as an immigrant running from persecution. His closest friends abandoned him, betrayed him. He died on a cross, and he almost certainly did not have good hair, despite what the pictures say. So Jesus is this life, the good life, but his life, according to the scriptures, is marked by humility. He's the one who, according to the Apostle Paul, made himself nothing, humbled himself, took the very nature of a servant. Like, his life is marked by suffering. that he identified with our suffering, that all the suffering of the world, our pain, our brokenness was put upon him. And he felt that, and he died a terrible, shameful death on the cross. So when you start thinking through the life of Christ, the only thing that is objectively and obviously good about it is the fact that 3 days later after he died, he rose from the dead. And that proved that he's life indestructible, unconquerable, that he is the life we're looking for, that he is the way to God, that his life really is the way. It's the good life. So here's the thing. If Jesus, the author of goodness, the author of life himself, if he lived this way in his example alone might be enough to give us pause and be like, maybe I should not want this stuff as much as I want that stuff. But the fact of the matter is, he didn't stop at just giving us a good example. He explicitly and repeatedly said, follow me. Like in humility and suffering. What's his famous words? Pick up your cross and follow me. That his life, the good life, is no longer defined by these things. That when we look at the good life with Jesus Christ, he says the good life is found here. If you want to find it, you have to go there. Which begs the question, do we need to rethink how we define the good life? Which begs the question, do we really want the good life? Which begs the question, do we really believe Jesus on this one? And this brings us to our text for today, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. If you have a text, you might want to turn there or on your phone. We'll have most of the key text up here today. Today we're going to go through the first section of it, verses 1 through 23. And by way of reminder, we started this conversation last week. Chapter 9 is, important context here, is between chapter 8 and chapter 10. All right? That's really important to remember. And if you remember, last week we covered this, chapter 8 and chapter 10. They were all about food sacrificed to idols, which, as weird as this sounds, is strangely relevant to us. Right? So here's, we talked about this a little bit. Here's another layer of the conversation we have to have, and I'll try and bring you up to speed if you weren't here last week. Okay, so by way of review, ancient Corinth. Ancient Corinth here is deeply, deeply a religious city, but it's religious in ways that seem utterly irreligious to us. So you may remember that they had a god for everything, the more the better. They had temples everywhere, but their worship involved prostitutes, animal sacrifices, and copious amounts of wine, which must have made the Mother's Day services really awkward. So this is the picture we get of the ancient church of Corinth. But so they offered these animals and sacrificed to these pagan gods. And due to the sheer quantity of sacrifices they offered, they had lots and lots of leftover meat, which created these extra industries that propped up next to the temples. That is why the temples would be right next to the market, because they would sell the meat in the market, but they would also have next to it, usually the temples were not just temples, they were also restaurants. But you shouldn't just think restaurants. Restaurants were everywhere. They were more like the banquet hall or conference center of their day. So if you were going to have a meeting that involved a big meal, it had to be at the temple restaurant. All right? So you get the picture here. When the Apostle Paul, when he addresses the Corinthians and talks about food sacrificed to idols, food that was offered as an act of worship to a pagan god, he speaks of three contexts. The first is the market, the agora in Greek. The second is he's speaking about if you show up at your neighbor's barbecue and they offer meat. And the third context is the temple restaurant. And in this, we didn't really uncover this layer. We hit it, but we didn't fully hit it last week. He's going to say, basically, if you show up at the market or if you go to your neighbor's barbecue and you have no idea where that meat came from, like that meat could have been offered as a sacrifice to a pagan god, Paul's like, don't worry about it. You don't know where the meat came from. And meat is meat, right? Meat cannot be evil. Except maybe scrapple. Scrapple may be evil. But he's like, in general, eat and drink. Whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. You can eat what you want. Food is not bad. And just because they offered it to a pagan god that doesn't exist, it doesn't affect the food. But he said there is a context in which you should not eat. And that is at the temple restaurant. And here's a scene, 150 AD, of what it looked like at a temple restaurant. You'll notice they're missing clothes. Like, yes. So you get this scene. He says, when you go there, if you go to a temple restaurant, whether the idol exists or not is not the issue at stake. The fact of the matter is all the people there believe it does exist. And if there's a new believer, a new Christian who sees you go into that temple and he's still struggling to believe that there could only be one God, he might be tempted to go back to idol worship, to believe a false God, to stop believing in Jesus. And this would be terrible. So don't go there because you're supporting an evil system. You're promoting the worship of a false God, and you might destroy the faith of other people. So this is the issue. The Apostle Paul says, food is not the issue. It's not what you eat. It's whether when you eat and drink, it affects other people, whether it promotes evil, whether it supports an evil system. And this gives us all kinds of ethical lessons to learn. And when sitting back, 2,000 years later, we look at this and we're like, this makes perfect sense, right? The do not participate in events that support idol worship rule, that's a good rule. Anyone against that? No, that's a good rule. Do not promote idol worship. So it seems kind of difficult from our perspective of why the Corinthians would ever want to show up there ever. But before we throw them under the bus, I just want to appreciate their perspective a little. The Apostle Paul has already granted two things. One, idols aren't real. There aren't real gods. There might be demons involved, but it's not a god. There's one true God. And two, he said food is food, and so this food doesn't affect you. It's not like you follow these certain rules, you eat these certain foods, and you get into heaven. Like, there is no, food test to get into heaven, right? It's not like, oh, you're vegan, you go straight up here. No. It doesn't apply. So they're sitting there and they're saying to Paul, okay, Paul, you just told us that idols aren't real and I don't have to follow any rules, but you're saying that I should then voluntarily give up eating at temple restaurants for the sake of others, right? But here's the deal. Do you understand what this will cost us? Temple restaurants were not just restaurants. I already mentioned this. They're like ballrooms. They're like conference centers. They are the intersection of personal and professional. They are the intersection of sacred and mundane. So you show up, and of course, yes, there's a priest at the front, and this is food sacrificed to idols, and he's going to say a little prayer, pour out some wine on the ground, and they're going to sing a song or whatever to their pagan god. But that God doesn't exist. That's what the Corinthians are saying, right? That doesn't exist. What's the big deal? Here's the deal, because that's not the only thing that happens there. You know what else happens there? Every wedding in town, every funeral, every anniversary, every birthday party, every big event, every party, ever. That's what happens there. So Paul, to stop going to those restaurants associated with temples is to commit social suicide. But it's not just social suicide, it's economic. So these were not just the centers of your social life. These were the centers of business. This is where you made your business deals, where you created trade deals. This is where you found your next job, where you hobnobbed with the who's who of industry. Deals were made over meals. Deals were made over meals. It rhymes, right? So it must be true. So this is the world. Like you're saying, Paul, to stop going to these restaurants is to pull ourselves out socially and economically out of Corinth. It is to ruin our lives socially and to tank our career. If I stop going to the temple restaurants, I can kiss the good life goodbye. Now, Paul, you're asking us to voluntarily commit social and economic suicide because some people believe in some made-up gods. And they're like, no thanks. Which brings us to chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians. Paul is going to address this, but I want you to hear how he addresses this. It's so important that it's sandwiched between this conversation on idolatry and on what's going on this big picture conversation. But in the middle of it, he's going to stop, and he's not going to directly answer any of their questions. He's going to indirectly answer this. He's going to say, hey, let me tell you about my experience. Let me tell you what I had to do in order to come to you so that you could hear about Jesus. Let me tell you about what I had to give up. Let me tell you about my life, and you tell me if it's good. So watch this. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 1, he says, am I not free? To which the answer is, yes. Am I not an apostle? To which the answer is, yes. Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Do you get it? Do you get it? Do you get it? He says, do you believe that God actually, I'm a free man, but God sent me to you, that I am empowered by God to be an apostle, to represent him? And they're like, yes, of course, of course. And he says, this is my defense on those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Yes. Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers, and Cephas, who's also Peter? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? And the answer is, no one. Who plants a vineyard and doesn't get to eat some of the grapes? No one. Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? And the answer is no one. Do I say this merely on human authority? I don't know, Paul, but you're going to tell us. Doesn't the law say the same thing? Doesn't God already speak to this? And then where does he pull this out? He pulls this out from Deuteronomy and says, for it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. We're like, that's great. He says, though, but is it about that ox that God is concerned? He's just like, do you think God wrote that in there? Do you really think he wrote that in there just for the ox? So if God is this concerned about an ox who's working, that he should be able to be provided for, if God is that concerned about an ox, how much more do you think he's concerned about his apostle who's working? Verse 10, surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much to reap a material harvest from you? If others have the right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? And like at this point, we're like this deep into it, 12 verses deep, we're like, okay, we get it, Paul. You've got rights. You have a right to be paid. You have a right to take a wife with you. You're an apostle. You're an important person. You have rights. But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Then he goes on, verse 13, don't you know that those who serve in the temple, and this is probably a reference to the pagan temple, that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple? Don't you know those pagan priests, when they offer those sacrifices, they get to eat from it? And those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar. In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. If a pagan priest gets to eat from that sacrifice, how much more should a true apostle sharing the gospel, the very word of life with you, how much more should they be provided for? And at this point, we're like, okay, Paul, we'll pay you. But that's not the point. The point is this, verse 15. But I have not used any of these rights. Paul's saying, I have rights, but I gave them up voluntarily for your sake. And I'm not writing this in hope that you'll do such things for me. Like, I don't want to get paid. I don't want your money, he says, for I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. Like, I'd rather die I want you to follow this logic for 14 verses. The Apostle Paul just laid it on thick. I have rights. I'm an apostle. I deserve to be paid. I deserve to be paid. I deserve to be paid. He said it like 10 different times in those 14 verses. Why? Why is he belaboring his rights so much? Because he wants them to see, but I didn't use my rights. I voluntarily gave up my rights. I voluntarily committed social suicide. I did not get married so that I could be an apostle to you. I voluntarily committed economic suicide. I did not take pay so that I could bring the gospel to you. Now, here's the question. What does any of this have to do with seeking the good life at temple restaurants? And the answer we're going to find is nothing and everything. If the Corinthians stop going to temple restaurants, they will suffer real loss socially and economically. They will. They'll probably become poor. They'll probably lose a lot of friends. But Paul wants them to see that there is a deeper logic at work here. A logic that works through his life, a logic that his life is built upon. That Paul is not encouraging them to suffer for suffering's sake. He's not elevating suffering itself. Suffering is not good. But suffering for Jesus, but suffering for love, but suffering to give someone the gospel, but suffering for something that's worth suffering for, that's different. So listen, Paul does not want to be poor. The Apostle Paul. And this Paul, either Paul, does not want to be poor. Paul took money from lots and lots of churches. I want you to listen to this, though. He turned down the money there in Corinth because he knew that Corinth was different. One, Corinth was terribly, terribly greedy. And he knew that if he came in and it seemed in any way that he was participating in their greed, that it would be a character issue. And the second thing he knew is that Corinth was a Roman system built on patronage, which meant that you would go in, you would look for a wealthy patron, a wealthy person to give you money, they would support you, and then they basically owned you. And the Apostle Paul said, I will not let even the appearance that I would sell this message. My message is not for sale. If people think my message is for sale, they will not listen to me. So he said, I will set aside my right to get paid so that I can reach people. And then he sucked it up and worked a day job as a tent maker. Paul voluntarily gave up his right to be paid for their sake. Was it costly? Yes. Was it hard? Yes. But was it worth it? Well, here's the difference. If Paul hadn't done this, there would not be a Corinthian church. If he hadn't done this, they would not know that Jesus is the good life. If he hadn't done this, they would still be looking for their life and their meaning at some pagan, drunken temple. So is it worth it? Paul thinks so. So something interesting about this, I want you to remember, we're in this longer conversation. The Apostle Paul, he's a master of just shifting directions, but really connecting thoughts, even though he's completely shifted directions. So he's in the middle of this conversation in chapter 8 on idols, on how false gods, believing in false gods will destroy you. They'll wreck your faith. They'll control you. They'll make promises that are full of lies. And if we're not careful, they'll wreck the church. They're destroying our world as we speak. So he's in that conversation. Then in the middle of that, he stops and he talks about his own life. And he comes back in chapter 9 to two big topics. In the middle of this conversation on idolatry, the first big topic he wants to talk about is money. And the next big conversation he wants to talk about? Sports. Now, why? Why? In the middle of a conversation on false gods that will control you and destroy your life, that will reshape you and demand your worship, why would he stop and say, let's talk about money and let's talk about sports? Can you imagine living in a world that was obsessed with money and sports? My! So money, though, money like a false god will make promises. It will promise you the good life. It will promise you That it can make life, it can save you, it can protect you. Money will promise you the life you have always wanted. But money's a liar. And I think we all know this. I mean, if you kind of air this out and just start thinking through it, you're like, no, money cannot buy the happiness, the relationship, the love, the joy, the peace, all the things that you really want in life. Money can't buy that. Like, we know that. But why is it so easy for us to slip into that and believe it again and again and again? Like, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but personally, I find myself getting in this rut, and it's usually about the time I start thinking about my kids' college or retirement. I start hyperventilating, and I just imagine spending my retirement years, my golden years of my life, working at Walmart saying, "Welcome to Walmart. Would you like a cart?" And it's a little horrifying. But I recognize that those fears that money makes promises that it can't keep, those fears are based on the false premise that somehow money can control my future, that money can somehow buy happiness. It's based on the false premise that God doesn't know what I need or for some reason doesn't care, and that's absolutely not true. Over the last 20 years of my life, when I look back over how God's provided for me and my family, you know what I see time and time again are these blessings, these amazing blessings that I've never earned and sometimes didn't even ask for, just dropped on me. So last month, I went on a once-in-a-lifetime trip to the Holy Lands, where I met with like scholars and leading journalists and colonels in the army and like this amazing like group of people and traveled all around and stayed in like the one of the greatest hotels in Jerusalem and ate amazing food and had these amazing experiences. And you know who paid for it? The Jewish Federation of North America. God sent the Jewish Federation of North America to bless this evangelical pastor. How do you explain that? I don't, except to say I have a good father. But here's the thing, even if I didn't have that, when I look back over the last 20 years, and I consider the times where we were most impoverished, and I mean there were times where we were poor. You know, when I look back at those times, I also find that those were some of the best, richest, most beautiful times of my life. That there's almost no association between having money and the good life. The Corinthians seem to believe that more money equals a better life. But Paul is going to point out here in this text here, if I'd believed this, if I'd believed that more money would give me a better life, you know what would have happened? I never would have came to Corinth. You never would have heard the gospel. You would be spiritually dead if I let money lead my decision making, because the Apostle Paul says money cannot save you. It cannot buy the good life. That the good life has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the gospel. So verse 16, he says, "For when I preach the gospel, the good news, I cannot boast, since I'm compelled to preach. Woe to me if I preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I'm simply discharging the trust committed in me. If I'm just doing this for the money, I'm completely missing out on the point of the gospel. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel." So I want you to hear this. The gospel message of the Apostle Paul is this. The good news is that driven by love, God sent his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, to come after you. That in humility, he set aside everything to come after you. That he took on the very nature of a servant. He humbled himself, made himself nothing. And when that wasn't enough, he died on a cross for you. He took your sins upon him. He gave his very life on your behalf. He set aside all of his rights on your behalf. And then 3 days later, he rose from the dead, proving that his life is the life that's truly life. It's unconquerable. This is the good news that Paul proclaims. Jesus is the life you're looking for. Jesus is the good life. And this gospel, this life that he's talking about, by definition, is not for sale. You cannot find this life by climbing a corporate ladder, climbing a social ladder. By definition, a wealthy Corinthian cannot give it to you, and they can't take it from you. The good life has nothing to do, in their context, with going to the temple restaurant. In our context, it has nothing to do with our social life being socially accepted. It has nothing to do with our economic success. And that's the point. The Apostle Paul sums it up this way: though I am free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. Do you hear this? Do you hear the flow here? Paul says, listen to this. I'm free. I'm truly free. God himself has set me free from my past. I'm free from trying to win other people's approval. I'm free from trying to win his approval. I'm free. I'm accepted. I'm loved. Therefore, in my freedom, I set aside my rights. I set aside my freedom. In freedom, I become a slave to everyone. I set the purpose of my life to serve others. I don't do what I want to do. I want to do what's best for you so that I may win as many as possible. The word win here has a double meaning, which we kind of miss in English. Win can mean win as in winning someone to Christ or winning someone to Jesus. Like they were away from Jesus or outside the church or on the fence and you won them in. But it can also mean to get paid. Do you hear that? So I'm free, but I become a slave so that I can get paid by as many as possible. So last summer, Jenny and I were traveling and went to this restaurant in Barcelona. And it only served like local fare, and they had this like preset menu. So you just got what they gave you, and it was like this multi-course thing, and it was just amazing. And but at the end of the meal, like every course was just fascinating and exotic, and at the end of the meal, they come out with this big plate for the two of us, and we're like, oh, dessert? This is going to be so exotic. And they put down the plate, and there's just 2 little chocolate truffles on it in the middle. I don't know about you, but I have my American expectations of dessert, right? I'm like, where's the big honking cheesecake or like the double molten fudge a la mode, whatever. Anyway, so I'm like, okay, truffles it is. Take one, pop it in my mouth. And it was like time stood still. It was a spiritual experience. It might be the best thing I've ever tasted, ever. Words fail. So, this verse is like that. It is small and unexpected and beautiful. And if you savor it, you will find something immensely spiritual in it. I want you to hear that the Apostle Paul is saying here, what I'm struggling to convey, it can't fit in your normal categories. Like it doesn't fit in the normal sense of how we speak. It doesn't fit our cultural understandings. It doesn't fit our normal relationships. It's totally foreign. It's like a different language, a different culture, from a different kingdom. Like it's something so unexpected that you can only put it in the form of paradox. Do you see this? He takes the contradictory ideas of, I'm free and I'm a slave. Like I refuse to accept money so that I can get paid by everyone. Like he takes these two ideas on both ends and he creates this massive paradox where you enter into it and you're like, what does this mean? You have to wrestle with it. You have to savor it to even try and make sense of it. How can it both be true that you're both free and a slave? How can you find the good life when you've given up all your rights, Paul? And if you notice, Paul is not the first one to come up with this style of communication. Jesus did this a lot. So you might remember, like, all these people were following Jesus, and we're like, we think you're someone important. We want to follow you. And what does Jesus do? He looks at them and says, whoever finds their life will lose it. And they're like, I thought I found what? No. Like, how can finding and losing, like, aren't those opposites? just a little while later in the same gospel, he says, whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. Do you hear it's upside down, it's backwards, it breaks our categories. It doesn't fit into our language. It's paradoxical, and that of course, is the point. Life with God does not fit into our categories. It doesn't fit into our normal picture, pretty picture of how we would understand the good life. Like it's upside down, it's backwards, it's paradoxical, and that if you seek the good life, you won't find the good life. That when we come to seek the good life, the first starting point is to understand that our view of this good life is fundamentally jacked up. That is based on a system, a language, a culture that can't give us what it promises. That is bent and broken. So the Corinthians, they thought they could find the good life in money, sex, power, pleasure, all the things that they would find at a temple restaurant. They believed that the life they really wanted was in a better job, a better spouse, a better car, a better vacation, better experiences, a better sports team. But over this, against this, the Apostle Paul proclaims the gospel, the good news that Jesus is the good life. Over this, against this, the Apostle Paul cries out, "It's not true! You're believing a lie! You're seeking the wrong things! You're climbing the wrong ladder! If you get all of that, you'll never get the good life!" The good life is found in following Jesus. The good life is found in humility, in sacrificing, in living for others, in giving everything out of love for God and for others. The good life is found on the way of the cross. The passage ends with this crescendo, very famously. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. So to the Jews, I ate kosher, and I did their rituals, and I did the things that had required for me to be accepted by them. And to those not having the law, to the Greeks, I became like one not having the law, though I myself am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law. I am constrained by the love of Christ, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I may save some. Now, this text is often used, I've used it before, it is often used to describe cultural relevance. So how should we do church? Should we have jeans or a suit? Should we have an organ or a guitar? Like, what should we have? Like, should we meet in a school building or a cathedral? Like, those are questions. And the answer is, it depends. If you're trying to reach certain types of people, you should bend. Those things can be conformed. You should be all things to all people for those reasons. And I think that is a true application of this text, that we need to ask not what is our preference, but what serves the people best. That's a good question to ask. But the further I've studied this, and especially as I studied this week, I became convinced that is a shallow interpretation of the text. Let me tell you what the Apostle Paul means when he says, to the Jews I became a Jew. The best example I found of this is actually in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and it's that story where he tells all the hard things he's been through to take the gospel to people. He says, I did hard labor, I was in prison, I was flogged, I was exposed to death, I was beaten with rods, pelted with stones, shipwrecked, nearly starved, in the open ocean for a full day. Like, it's an impressive list. The man has suffered some. But then he gets to this line in chapter 11, this 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24. He says this, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. Now this is fascinating. This is a particular Jewish legal penalty. I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. It's a Jewish law on the books. You can go back to the Mishnah and read about this. The offender would have to take off their shirt voluntarily, and they would have to be strapped up, and they'd be whipped with this terrible whip. Sometimes a cat of nine tails, sometimes just a leather whip, but they would be lashed 1/3 on the front, and then 2/3 on their back. The reason for 40 minus 1 is because in the book of Deuteronomy it says that if you whip a man more than 40 times, you will degrade him, you will dehumanize him, and they believe that there's a possibility that you might kill him, and that would not be okay. So they did one less than that. What's the very limit we can beat someone and not kill them? Paul says 5 times that happened to me. Now, if you know anything about the Apostle Paul, you're not particularly surprised, right? Like, he went into every community he could. He would go into the synagogue and say, hey, you're Jews, I'm a Jew, but you're missing something. Let me tell you about Jesus. And that could go one of 2 ways. One, they'd be like, that's amazing, let's worship Jesus. He is God. And the other is, you're a blasphemer, we need to kill you. And so it's not a surprise. 5 times he was beaten within an inch of his life. Now, the interesting thing here is that when you study the Jewish legal penalty, you realize that the Apostle Paul did not have to accept this beating ever. So let's paint the picture. He goes in, he proclaims Jesus is Lord. Some say, let's worship him. Others say, let's beat him. According to the tradition, the Mishnah is where you'll find this. The Apostle Paul deserves to be cut off. That means if he's a blasphemer, according to their laws, he needs to be cut off. That means permanently kicked out of every Jewish community, period. He can never go to worship. He can never talk to them. He's dead to them. That's what he deserves. But there was a loophole. If someone did not want to be cut off from the Jewish people, they could voluntarily submit to receive the 40 lashes minus 1. Rather than give up his right to proclaim Jesus to his Jewish brothers and sisters, he voluntarily chose to be beaten within an inch of his life, not once, not twice, 5 times. I'd rather be beaten within an inch of my life than give up the right to come to you, to love you enough, to share the gospel with you. That's what that means. To a Jew, I will never give up being a Jew. And to a Greek, I will never give up being a Greek. And to the weak, I will be weak. I have become all things to all people, no matter the cost, that by all possible means I might save some. That some might come to believe in Jesus because he's worth it. He's that beautiful. He's that good. He is the good life. And he finishes with this. I do all of this. All of this. I give up everything for the sake of the gospel that I may share in its blessings. And this is what the Apostle Paul means by getting paid. He says, when I give up all my rights, when I give up all that I think my life is about and all the stuff that I think I deserve, when I set that aside for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of you, not only do I win some of you, but I win. I win. Like, I get more of Jesus. I find life. I taste freedom. I experience a pleasure that sex and entertainment and a temple restaurant can never give me. Like, I feel a sense of belonging in the family of God that my group of friends cannot give me. That by voluntarily becoming a slave to all, the Apostle Paul says he experiences the good life. A life that this world knows nothing about. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you would work in our hearts and repaint in our minds the picture of the good life. I pray that we would live lives that were reshaped by the life of Christ, God. I pray that you would look over our lives and right now have your Spirit put his finger on our hearts, Lord, about areas where we've maybe believed the lie that money or careers or friends or other things can give us what we really seek in life. And God, I pray that you would give us a glorious picture. And by glorious, God, I mean just a picture that we can't get over. A picture that stops us in our tracks. Of the beauty of living life for Christ. The beauty that the Apostle Paul talked about. Where actually giving all this up is not about giving it up. It's about what we get. It's about what we win. It's about what we get paid. in terms of grace, in terms of life, in terms of freedom. I pray that you change us in Jesus' name. Amen.